And Ann, we need to do our regular land.
Our land acknowledgement, yes.
So I will be reading our land acknowledgement. The Water Advocates' main activism areas are located on the traditional homelands of the Southern Tiwa pueblos of Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to the Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. Thank you.
And I realized I was excited about our presentations. Norm has an announcement that's related to regional water planning that we want to make before we get started. Norm, did we lose you?
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
I have an announcement to make that is supportive, very much in line with the program that we're going to hear from the Interstate Stream Commission this evening, and it's good news. On June 11th, the Bernalillo County Commission unanimously approved the Bernalillo County 2024 Comprehensive Plan. It has several new 21st century water policies, and I'm just going to read you a few snippets of the new policies that were unanimously adopted by the Commission. Number one, plan and maintain an adequate water supply and water demand balance that sustainably meets municipal, agricultural, and ecosystem needs. Two, calls for full county participation in regional water planning. Three, the county will coordinate water quality and quantity management to meet essential needs and protect community and ecosystem health. The county will emphasize a total systems approach to water management, and the county will integrate drainage, stormwater protection, physical and legal water availability, water conservation, in my opinion, most importantly, the balance between water supplies and needs in land use decision-making and planning processes. So I wanted to recognize the Commission for its leadership and to thank Chairwoman Barbara Baca in particular. As far as I know, Bernalillo County is the first in the state to commit to full participation to implement the 2023 Water Security Planning Act. I'll turn it back to you.
So we'll get started. Put questions in the chat. If you're still coming in, put your name and place and affiliation, if you like, in the chat. And Hannah, I think we're ready to get started.
I think you're muted, Hannah, if you didn't know.
Hannah is speaking to us from Cloudcroft, where she is attending a wedding.
Okay, I did it.
Good job.
Evening, everyone. Hopefully you're also seeing my slides. Excuse the minor technical difficulty while I was trying to get my screen share up and running. So let me know. Anne, can you see the slide deck?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. I want to start by thanking the advocates for hosting us in this evening's session. And for hosting their ongoing series of these presentations and conversations, which I think are incredibly valuable and are fortunately recorded so folks can listen to them later. It's really an incredible service. So I want to start by thanking the advocates for hosting this evening's session. And then I want to thank everyone who's participating this evening for taking your time to listen in and engage and get informed. I also want to start by acknowledging and thank you for the introductions and Dr. Phil King, who's co-presenting with me this evening. It's been fabulous working with Dr. King and his role as a senior advisor to us and the Office of the State Engineer for Groundwater Planning, and having his insight as we shape next steps related to regional water planning has been incredibly helpful. And so I want to thank him. I think the plan for this evening, and this was mentioned earlier, but folks were still logging on. We're wanting to use this opportunity to, number one, provide all of you with an update related to the Water Security Planning Act and our efforts at Interstate Stream Commission to implement the act, and have a little bit of a QA with you all about that process. So we're going to run through an initial set of slides that describe sort of where we're at, what is the big picture, what is our vision for where we're headed, not only this year for the remainder of 2024, but 2025 and beyond, and how this all fits together in addressing sort of the big challenges we're facing across the state. But we also want to use this evening's time to do the experiment, which is have a community conversation, is what we're calling this. So after we do the QA related to the slide deck that I'll run through and Phil and I will present on, we want to present to you a set of questions, and I'll explain about those questions a little bit later, and then have an open conversation with you all. So we'll be watching the time, and Anne and Brittany and others will be helping us track how we make sure we have time for all of the above. On this initial slide, you'll see not only my contact information, and of course we'll make these slides available for everyone later, but also the rest of the planning team at Interstate Stream Commission. So Andrew Erdman, who many of you know, is our water planning program manager. Sarah Fox and Amanda Nezzi are part of our team. We are fortunate enough that in this year's legislative session, we got additional funding for staff capacity at Office of the State Engineer and Interstate Stream Commission, and that will result in additional planning staff, at least one additional member to our staff coming next fiscal year. So we're excited to be building a much bigger team, which is great news. When I started at Interstate Stream Commission, actually for much of my time here since 2014, we've had one planner. So you look at other states, Colorado and other states that have giant teams. So having a bigger team is going to be very important. Before I move through the slide deck, I just wanted to see if Dr. King had any additional opening comments, and then we'll run through the slide deck and do some QA. Phil, do you have anything you want to add before I get started?
Yeah, I would just add that while I am new working directly with the Interstate Stream Commission and Office of the State Engineer, I, of course, have been working with EBID and various other entities down in the Lower Rio Grande, and in fact have been through previous regional water planning efforts. And I hope to sort of use that background as we go through here to give you a little perspective on the current effort, because it is in fact very different.
Great. Thank you, Phil. So yes, and I see that some of the folks on tonight, probably there's a range of experience. There may be other participants who've participated in all of the previous rounds. There's been 2 previous rounds of regional water planning conducted by the state of New Mexico through the Interstate Stream Commission. And then there's probably some folks on this evening who've never engaged at all. And so hopefully we can make this presentation relevant to all of you. Just to give a little bit of context, the original regional water planning statute for New Mexico was passed in 1987. It was considered to have largely sort of met its purpose in terms of the original statutory language. And one of the recommendations of the Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force that was convened by State Engineer Mike Hammond in 2022, which both Dr. King and Norm served on, one of those recommendations was for the state of New Mexico to revisit that statute. And so in the 2023 legislative session, what's called the Water Security Planning Act was passed unanimously. So I want to thank also the folks on today. There's a few folks who were instrumental in crafting the statute. It was a collaborative process with a bunch of different folks. It ended up being picked up as a state agency bill by the governor's office. And then it got a lot of support from legislators. I should also say that the task force had legislative advisors, which were incredibly helpful as we moved through that task force process. The recommendation from the task force was for us to essentially entirely re-envision regional water planning for New Mexico. So I think we've done a lot of evaluating and sort of lessons learned at the agency about what worked and what didn't work in those previous rounds of planning. And we certainly continue to welcome any feedback that any of you all have about that as well. So the Water Security Planning Act, again, passed in the 2023 legislative session, again, is intended to transform and entirely reinvigorate regional water planning for New Mexico. The statute requires a number of things, some of which are outlined on this slide, and I'm going to go through a few of the key points, and I think these are things that really distinguish it from the previous statute. The statute requires that the state of New Mexico ensure scientific integrity of the planning process and provide the best available data, science, and models to the future planning regions. The other thing that this statute did, and one of the pieces that we heard a lot of feedback on from previous rounds of planning, was that a lot of work went into plans, but that they didn't really translate into implementation. So this statute really has tried to better link the planning process to implementation. One of the ways that it does that is it requires the future planning regions to prioritize projects and activities for funding. So Interstate Stream Commission under the new statute will be tasked with reporting to the legislature annually, not only on the planning process, but also on the priorities coming out of the regions for funding. And this is something that legislators really appreciated. In previous rounds of regional water planning, those regional plans would collect what ended up being very long lists of potential projects, programs, and policies with no prioritization. I think when we rolled all of those up into the 2018 state water plan, there were literally thousands of recommendations at a tune of like $4 billion or something with no prioritization. It's very hard for state decision makers to know what to do with that. So this will be a new process in terms of really trying to figure out how to better link the planning process with implementation. My hope, and we'll talk a little bit more later about what to look for looking into the 2025 legislative session, but ultimately my hope would be that the state of New Mexico, like is done in Colorado, would set aside chunks of money for every region to implement their plans and do that on a regular basis. So having a consistent funding stream going to the regions to implement their recommendations with state support is something that we're very much looking to do long term. The statute also calls on us to build on and incorporate existing planning efforts, so not be redundant. This isn't intended to reinvent the wheel in any way. There's a ton of really good planning already occurring at the local level across the state, including the updates that Norm provided at the beginning of the meeting today from Bernalillo County. So how does this effort not duplicate those efforts, but bring all of that expertise and planning and figure out how to integrate it at the regional level? It also is obviously grounded in state water law. So there was some concern that this would jeopardize existing water rights. No, this is certainly grounded in state water law, although it could be a framework for regions to work towards implementing AWRM or active water resources management, for regions to develop alternative administration schemes that more meet their local values, right? So that could something that the statute says could occur through this regional water planning process. It also calls on Interstate Stream Commission to address tribal water issues by forming a Water Security Tribal Advisory Council, and I'll talk more about that later in the slideshow. Also, and not called out on this slide, and I think many of you already know this, the statute calls on us to revisit the delineation of the regions themselves, and to think through how to better delineate those regions to support effective planning. And it also calls on us to think through who should be involved and what the roles should be of stakeholders and at what level. And through every step of implementing this statute, we are working to have very robust public engagement, and including the activities coming up this year. And you know what, as I move through these slides, Phil, if there's ever something you want to just jump in on, I certainly encourage you to do that.
Okay.
In fact, so this is a figure that was used in what's we call the Leap Ahead report. This was the panel that Dr. King served on with others, convened by New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. They issued a report, which many of you have seen. If you haven't, I highly recommend you look at it in 2022. That was a synthesis of all sort of current, as of that time, science related to climate change impacts to New Mexico's water resources and landscape. I think it's been an incredible driver for a lot of the work related to water that's happened since then. It was initiated as sort of the foundation of the governor's 50-year water plan, which came out this January. Also something I encourage you all to look at. And those documents and links to that stuff can be found on our webpage, which is coming up shortly on these slides. But in a nutshell, I think this figure, which many of you have seen, shows not future projections, but observed data related to temperature and precipitation. And I think that what we are already seeing is this trend in increasing temperatures. I'm, as someone said earlier, actually in Cloudcroft right now for a cousin's wedding. I'm not sure whether we'll pull off this wedding on Saturday, given the fires in Ruidoso, which certainly are alarming. It's worth it to take a moment to just acknowledge what these folks are going through. Sorry, excuse me. I think those fires are certainly a wake-up call for us, just like the massive, unprecedented forest fires in 2022, Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak, about climate change, right? So the takeaway here is that with increasing temperatures, even with the uncertainty related to precipitation, which you see sort of staying even or fluctuating up and down a little bit in the last few decades, with increasing temperatures, we're looking at increasing evapotranspiration from our landscape. So essentially less water as a result of the increasing temperatures. That report, let me go back to this slide for a second. The big takeaway from that is we should be preparing for and expecting something like 25% less stream flow in our rivers and recharge to our aquifers by 2070. And obviously that's a broad brush numbers. There's going to be different impacts in different parts of the state, but it's important for us to realize the gravity of something like preparing for that level of increasing water scarcity. So hence the urgency for us to plan and start planning now. The other thing that I think is worth noting on this slide has a little animated figure. This came to us again, thanks to the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources and their team implementing the Water Data Act. And it's just a good visualization of how quickly just in the last 100 years, we have come to rely on groundwater. So as you see, the red dots on this figure are groundwater wells. And so as you see the time progress through the last 100 years, you see the increasing number of wells across the state. We are going to, as surface water decreases, increasingly rely on groundwater. So there's a critical need for us to be planning around, and this is part of why we brought Dr. King on board to help be senior advisor in groundwater planning. Critical need for us to engage around groundwater issues and groundwater management, given that there are, certain aquifers that, are fairly resilient and have a lot of recharge, and others that we really are just mining, right? So what does that mean about how to plan for the future? All right, so part of what was asked of us in this presentation tonight was sort of place the work of where we are right now in the context of our big picture vision related to implementing this important new act. So the act passed in 2023, as I mentioned. Last year in 2023, we had a number of things going on. We also had a state water plan update and the governor's 50-year water plan. So as we were in parallel to working on those two other major components in our small planning shop, we were also teeing up what was to come in 2024, which is our effort at very extensive engagement related to what this future of regional water planning needs to look like. As we see it, the last act passed in 1987, as I mentioned, and was in place for decades. What we do the moment the opportunity in front of all of us, and this is not just Interstate Stream Commission, but everyone in New Mexico, the opportunity we have in front of us related to the Water Security Planning Act is the ability to re-envision what that process should look like potentially for the next decades to come, right? And so we wanted to really do this carefully and thoughtfully, and with a tremendous amount of public input on what it needs to look like. And that takes time. So 2024 has been focused on there's going to be multiple rounds of multiple bites at the apple, right, for folks to weigh in on what this needs to look like. The first is this big open house events that we started back in April. We had committed when we wrapped up the last round of regional water planning that we would be back at those regions. And so there are currently 16 planning regions in New Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, the statute tasks us with sort of revisiting like that delineation of those regions. But we are slightly more than halfway through holding in-person open house, is what we call them, events in each of those existing 16 planning regions to collect input to inform the rules and guidelines that are called for by the Act. In addition to those open house events, the first week of June, we opened a website which has all of the same content, the sort of same set of questions that are at the in-person events are all online as well. And there is additional content that's online only. The in-person open houses have a lot packed into them. It's maybe even too much. We don't want to overwhelm people more than we needed to, so we have a bunch of content that's only online. You can answer a few questions and then come back and answer it again. We encourage everyone here, if you haven't done it already, to participate in either of those forums, the in-person events or the online version of that. And then also and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, we're really working actively to convene the Water Security Tribal Advisory Council as a key part of our work in 2024. The plan for the rest of the year in 2024 is later this year, we'll have captured input through the open house events and through the web forum, the web open house events. We'll use that to help shape a draft set of rules and guidelines. And the reason that there are rules and guidelines called for by the Act is that the rules are pretty firm. Like we're going to go through a rulemaking process. We're expecting them to stay in place for a long time, or that's the hope anyway. So the statute requires certain things to land in rules. And then there's also guidelines which can be will be adopted by our commission, Interstate Stream Commission, but can be improved over time. So we have the opportunity through the guidelines to sort of learn by doing and update as we go. So later this year, we'll be issuing, based on the input we heard through the open houses, a draft set of rules and guidelines for public comment. So that's where people will actually see like what we're thinking would make sense in writing in terms of those rules and guidelines. We'll collect input on those drafts. So that's sort of like the second bite at the apple. And then the goal is to initiate the rule promulgation process, so the official process, before next year's legislative session. So either in December or by early January, initiate rule promulgation. That will have, hearings and a whole process by which the public can weigh in there. Once those rules are in place, we may have to adjust the guidelines somewhat based on what happens in rule promulgation. Then the guidelines would go to our commission, Interstate Stream Commission. All of that means that our goal is to have the rules and guidelines in place by 2025, it'll probably be mid-year by the time all of that gets in place. And then we'll start working on standing up regions. And I want to set expectations here in that we're not going to be able to stand up every single region at once. So we're going to have to do them in a phased way. We don't know which regions we'll be starting with. I know that may be a question for some people, but certainly something that we're welcoming feedback, honestly welcoming feedback on all of this. And then the idea would be for future regional water planning to happen more frequently, to be an ongoing process, whereby those plans are getting updated on a regular cycle, and the state is supporting that in an iterative and staggered way.
And if I could just pipe in there, Hannah.
Please, thank you.
I would, for those of you that have been through the the regional planning process before, there's a key conceptual difference that it's important to understand at this point. And that is that in the previous iterations, the regional planning entities went through their process. They negotiated, they shared data, they did various things. And then they produced a report which signaled the end of the effort, and it went and sat on the shelf. In this case, particularly as the uncertainty of our water supply has increased, both due to climate change and the increasing shift of supply to the groundwater systems due to shrinking surface water supply. This is much more urgent, and our future is we realize now that our future is much more uncertain than we realized a decade or so ago. And it is uncertain because as you look at the climate, we're seeing distinct, undeniable evidence of climate change already happening. We have modeling to push that forward, but the modeling has to make assumptions, and those assumptions carry uncertainty with it. Even within a scenario, there's a great deal of uncertainty about the future. And so the key, or one of the absolute just major conceptual differences here, is that this is necessarily an ongoing and adaptive process. We are not trying to finish up a report, stick it on the shelf, and walk away. We are intending that this should be an ongoing iterative process where we will adapt as water user communities to the cards we're dealt. And let's be realistic, it's not a very rosy outlook, but we do need to develop that ability to adapt and be resilient to whatever hydrologic futures we're facing.
Thanks, Phil. So appreciate that comment, and emphasizing that point is critical. And that is exactly what is intended here, for sure. And that it would be ongoing and iterative. Thank you. I wanted to just highlight, since it is a key component of what we're doing in 2024, a little bit about the Water Security Tribal Advisory Council. Again, this was a component that was built into the statute really during the session during 2023, and some key folks thought it was critical to include. I feel very grateful for them because I think it's a super important part of the statute. It calls on Interstate Stream Commission to work with the Indian Affairs Department to convene this Tribal Advisory Council. And I should also say, as part of the governor's 50-year water plan, Interstate Stream Commission had convened what was called the Tribal Water Work Group to provide input and release a parallel plan. And that plan is also on our website. It's called the Tribal Water Report. And through that process, it really made me realize that not only for 50-year water plan, but for water planning in general, for the long term, that we needed to have that kind of engagement with our tribal communities because of their distinct and important issues. And so what we've done is week before, we convened an interim committee. Outreach to tribal leadership started in January. Again, working really closely with the Office of the State Engineer, Indian Affairs Department. We convened what we're calling an interim committee, which includes both leadership, but also technical and legal expertise from the tribes. At our interim committee meeting, we had 16 tribes participating very actively. That interim committee is really intended to help shape what the council, or WISTAC, needs to look like, and craft some proposals for tribal leadership and the agencies to consider. However, the concept is that the council itself would be in place by around October, so that that council can not only weigh in on the draft rules and guidelines, as I mentioned, to come out later this year, but also weigh in on the potential need for tribe-specific rules and guidelines related to that council and how they would engage in an ongoing way in the water planning process. And so we're very much looking forward to that work with those groups. That committee is scheduled to meet in early July for a whole day of just sort of workshopping and digging into this stuff. So again, outreach and input is we're in the thick of it right now in terms of that very first component, the open house events in person and also online. The events are not sit down and listen to a presentation. They are very interactive. They have stations that have targeted questions that we're collecting input on. For the community conversation part of this evening's event, we have much of those questions, and we'll run through them and have a conversation here is what we're hoping to do. And then all of that input is being collected, including in the online portal. The website for that is on the slide here. It's mainstreamnm.org. That site we're really starting to use as a hub for this entire initiative. So not only can you participate in the content for the open house meetings and provide your input there, but also a bunch of the reports that I mentioned throughout this evening's presentation are posted there. Our team is also putting together blog posts that sort of highlight real life stories about why planning is important, and those are will continue to be updated. There's also the ability to just provide general comment. Like, we have very targeted questions, but you can provide your 2 cents about whatever. You can upload a document if you want something for us to take into consideration as we're drafting the rules and guidelines. All of that is on that website. And we're really using the in-person and online forum as the portal by which we're then going to capture everything that we've heard. Our contractors supporting this effort will produce a report, and all of that will help inform the draft rules and guidelines to come out later this year. So again, this slide shows where we've had the in-person events so far and which are remaining. All of those open house events, the content, so the stations that have various questions, is the same in any of those regions. You don't have to go to the one in your region. You can go to any of them. We've done this intentionally with the last of these events being in Albuquerque so that we can try to catch anybody who wanted to hit one but couldn't in their local region. They can come to Albuquerque on August 7th. But again, everything that's at those in-person events is also online. So we're trying to create multiple pathways to capture input on what this needs to look like. And again, this is a critical moment for you all and all of your networks. So help us get the word out to engage, because it will help shape how the boundaries are delineated. And maybe just to comment briefly on that, you know, how they're delineated has the potential to optimize various things. If they're delineated based on hydrologic boundaries, which the current regions aren't, there's a real benefit to that, in that region is then now planning for a shared supply, right? On the flip side, if they're delineated more on sort of administrative boundaries, that maybe optimizes the potential to implement plans because there's an existing administrative structure like counties or whatever, COGS or something. And there's real pros and cons in all of that. So it's important to think through carefully, and we want to hear from you. Also, the questions have to do with who should be engaged and at what level, and what should the plans accomplish or what should be included in the plans. Let's see, I think I'm almost through this initial slide deck, and then I'm going to ask Phil to make some comments before we do the Q&A on the first part here. So the online input, the web portal to provide that input will be open through August 18th. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be collecting all that input to inform the draft rules and guidelines that we'll put out for public comment, and then get to the rule promulgation late this year or early next year. We also are really trying to show as much progress as possible in implementing this act in advance of the 2025 legislative session. so that we can advocate for funding. And I should say that implementation of this act is called out in the governor's 50-year water plan as part of the first set of recommendations. That plan is grouped into sort of three main categories: water conservation, identifying new supplies, and then water and watershed protection. And so in that conservation section of the plan, there's a whole component related to water education and engaging communities in planning. And it calls on us through that plan to implement this act. And so we're going to be looking to you all to not only participate every step of the way as much as you can, also get word out to your networks to participate through all the opportunities this year. And you can also sign up to get updates, email updates through our website, but also help us think and strategize around both the sort of interim committee meetings this year and then looking into the 2025 legislative session and how to prioritize funding for this effort long term. And so I think with that, and in light of a priority talk more than I intended to, I'd like to see what all Phil would like to add to this, and then we'll do a little QA before I switch gears into the community conversation part. So go ahead, Phil.
Okay, well, as and mentioned in my bio, I did work on the leap ahead analysis and then on the water task force, which is kind of, I find myself continuing in that direction now. And the one thing that I would really stress here is that this seems like a long and drawn out process, but in fact, it is quite urgent and we need to make rapid progress on it. In the past, we could sort of do nothing and maybe it would rain and everything would get better, or maybe we'd have a good snow year and everything would get better. The probability of that happening in any given year is reducing. We know that very clearly, and we are dealing with a positive feedback system, which is not a good thing in this case. It means that when we have a reducing supply of surface water, that reduces the recharge to groundwater. And at the same time, we have many of those surface water users then going to the groundwater as actually provided in New Mexico law. So not only are we cutting off the recharge, we're increasing the draw on that groundwater system. And so it can very quickly spiral out of control. We need the institutional capability, the governance to respond to these developing crises as they form up. Remember, I spent 31 and a half years down in the lower Rio Grande, and we were litigating on essentially the Texas versus New Mexico subject matter since 1998 that I was involved in it. And we're right now waiting for the Supreme Court to drop their decision. So that's, multi-decadal sort of response time, and we really haven't gotten anything done to address the issue in any case. So what we need to do is start with, the planning from the water use communities from the regional level and work upward. One of the complaints about the previous round of regional water planning was that it was too top down. You'll see that the Interstate Stream Commission is pushing the action here, but the actual planning will come very much out of the regions. And so these are important characteristics of this effort to understand. And I hope that if you have the perfectly honestly earned cynicism about regional water planning, this will, hopefully bring you back, get you engaged, and make you an active participant in it, because this is the shot we've got. If we don't take care of it, Mother Nature will, and she can be rather cruel. So with that, Hannah, why don't we get on with the questions?
Sounds great. Thank you, Phil. Agree with everything you just said.
So we had a few questions come up in the chat, and I apologize ahead of time. I'm going to be mispronouncing names, so please forgive me if I butcher your name. Eduardo Krasilovsky asked, what is the difference between regional and local, legally speaking? So regional planning, local planning, what's the difference?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. Maybe Phil has something to say on that too. So first of all, I'm not an attorney, but I think that when I was referring to local planning earlier, I was really referring to the planning that's happening currently at the city level or at the county level. And I anticipate these regions, we have currently 16 planning regions. We'll see what we hear from this public input process. I would anticipate us having likely fewer regions moving into the future. So at a larger scale than what I was referring to as local earlier. And Phil, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would add to it's more than just the cities that have local planning going on as well. You have irrigation districts who have water conservation plans, drought plans, various sort of efforts that they've done. There's some planning actually down to fairly small water systems that are, they're required to do 40-year water plans and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of groundwork that's already been done together. And so a lot of this is actually bringing that all together and trying to make sense of it. And hopefully not having to completely reinvent the wheel.
And hopefully not saying, well, this region will, solve its water problems by taking water from another region. So I think, we have to be looking at the state has a role in here to make sure that we're keeping our compacts whole and looking at, the bigger picture in that process.
Thank you. Bill Bright asked, will the state plan include the west side of the divide? Gallopin area is completely dependent on non-renewing aquifers, and the promise of the San Juan River water keeps getting set back as its flow decreases yearly. Officials seem to avoid even mention of water conservation for fear of scaring away new businesses.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So to be clear, Interstate Stream Commission is tasked by statute with both statewide water planning under the 2003 State Water Plan Act, and then regional water planning. And so this work is really re-envisioning the regional water planning piece. Now, how that informs the state water planning is an important component and something we're certainly thinking about. As to your part of the state, absolutely, those considerations and concerns that you just highlighted in terms of groundwater reliance and delays in getting Navajo Gallup water supply pipeline on board would be part of a regional water planning process in that part of the state, and hopefully would help either emphasize the urgent need to take various actions or help those communities plan around the associated challenges with the situation that you're describing. So yes.
And could you read the last part of that question again?
Yes. Gallopin area is completely dependent on non-renewing aquifers, and the promise of San Juan River water keeps getting set back as its flow decreases yearly. Officials seem to avoid even mention of water conservation for fear of scaring away new businesses.
Right. Well, I'm sure that varies, region by region, city by city, individual by individual even. I have certainly been vocal about my concerns about our hydrologic future, and I've certainly taken some heed on it. That's a valid point.
And I also am glad you wanted to come back to that conservation point. I think our take at Interstate Stream Commission is that there will not be one single solution to this. I think it's going to take a full slate of solutions, and many of those are going to have to be conservation. There is no sort of extra special source that we can identify that will fill the gap when we talk about the climate projections. And so thinking through how to do conservation in a thoughtful way, with thinking through impacts to local communities, is part of what's intended in this process, and in supporting regions and thinking that through.
Thank you. Bob Wesley asked regarding adaptive management, should guidelines be amendable at the regional level?
Such a good question, Bob. I'm overdue to catch up with you, I know. Yeah, I think that the goal, I mean, this is what's challenging about this, is the goal with the rules and guidelines is to set up the right framework, whereby that framework can really facilitate and enable effective planning at the regional level without constraining it, but also recognizing that those future regions are going to have a lot of nuance in terms of what the challenges are that they're facing, what the local interests are. And so, we wouldn't want them to be so prescriptive statewide that then that's limiting, but we also want to ensure that they provide a stable framework to support effective planning. And that's the magic. So I don't think that the guidelines should help guide what happens within the regions, but allow for them to have some autonomy in terms of what they need to meet their local issues, right? And that's where, brainstorming with you all about what that means, like what does that framework look like, is part of what we're doing on trying to capture input on through this process.
Thank you. Betsy Diaz asked, with the broad public input the ISC now has from the public, what specific requests for full funding from the New Mexico State Legislative Finance Committee might the ISC directly ask for to help communities develop regional water planning and management?
So unfortunately, I would say that we're still working internally and with the Gov's office on what sort of the water package request might look like in the 2025 session. I can share that I think there's already discussions underway about looking at establishing a bigger water fund. We have the opportunity right now to harness a bunch of state funding. And so something not unlike the legacy fund, the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund, but having a large pot of money available to support water infrastructure projects, which is what the Water Trust Fund does now, but initiatives like the Legacy Fund that are also programming, right? So how do we capture the large amount of funding that we have right now? This feels like kind of a magic moment where there's state money and federal money. How do we harness that with the urgency in mind that Phil is talking about, to set up the funding mechanism to support processes looking into the future, including like such a fund like that could potentially support in an ongoing way the regions and implementing the plans coming out of the regions. But at this point, I don't have details in terms of what the specific ask from the executive would be heading into the session. Certainly once that's more in place, we'll be sure to share that with the advocates. I know that the LFC is scheduled their next water subcommittee meeting, or is planning to, in conjunction with their September meeting, which I believe will be held in Albuquerque. And so hopefully there'll be an opportunity for some of us from the executive agencies to present on where that discussion is headed at that time.
Thank you. And the next question, you basically answered most of that, but I do want to put in the nuance that's in there. So just keep that in mind, that it's probably this similar answer. LaDonna Clayton says, as a follow-up to Betsy Diaz, Stacy Timmons of the New Mexico Bureaucracy Bureau recently stated that the Bureau needs $1.2 million in additional recurring funds for staff and resources, and $175 million to drill 100 wells over the next 12 years to gather the vital data that informs our understanding and drives decision-making for New Mexico. How does Stacy Timmons' request for legislative funding reflect or interface with ISC's needs? And then again, to share your funding needs with us so that we can support you. And then just another intention that we've got to be aggressive to be able to get you the funding you need to continue this work.
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. and Phil may have some thoughts on this as well, because his role as senior advisor for groundwater planning is really something that's been a collaborative effort across ISC, OSE, and Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources in New Mexico Tech. I think that effort is absolutely critical, because that, as I mentioned earlier, the statute calls on us supporting regions with the best available science data and models. That is part of the interface with New Mexico Tech and the Water Data Act and their aquifer mapping program. And so the ability, and Phil is already working with Stacy on some of this, to support future regions with the best information possible related to their groundwater and what they're reliant on, and what's known and not known about those aquifers is a critical component. One of the things that's somewhat alarming is, that figure that I had that had all the red wells appearing over time. We actually are collecting less data than we were a few decades ago in several parts of the state related to groundwater and surface water. It is going to be absolutely imperative that we have the right data to support decision making. And so we are fully behind New Mexico Tech's request related to the aquifer mapping program and additional recurring funding to support that, because I think that we're going to be looking to them to provide that science foundation to the future regions. And I don't know if Phil has something he wants to add.
Yeah, as we go in and try to put together summaries of the various the groundwater conditions, aquifer conditions, water use, and so on, in the various regions, even the basic data gaps like aquifer water level, from which you can calculate aquifer storage, and very importantly, changes in aquifer storage, the gaps are humongous, and that is both spatially and temporally. You might find wells that were operated for 15 years from the mid 60s to the late 70s, and then shut down until 2019 or something. Some never came on, but they're just, we just really got to get a handle on this, because groundwater is complex. You've got to simplify it somewhat, but you got to make it as simple as possible, but not one bit simpler. And right now we're just running blind in a lot of areas.
Yeah, Stacy likes to use the analogy of driving a car without a gas gauge. So we need that data to know where we're at, right? So thanks.
I had a car without a gas gauge, a 1960 VW Bug.
Sounds like a terrible idea.
It does.
So investing in that is going to be really important for us to do the planning that we need to do. Yep.
Well, I think we have time for one last question before we move into our community conversation portion of the evening. Our last question is from Jeannie Logston. About the state having a role, do you foresee that state level rules and guidelines will deal with equity issues? For example, agricultural interests might have an objection if they were allocated a smaller percentage of available water in some regions rather than in other regions, or will such objections be addressed by litigation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And first, I want to just say, again, this planning won't replace in any way existing water rights or impact existing water rights. So the planning process itself isn't going to dictate like how much water different water use sectors or water users themselves get. We will still be operating, on a priority administration system with regards to water rights. However, it will provide an opportunity, I think, for communities at a regional level to identify their shared set of values and figure out if there are alternatives to that priority administration that better align with their values. And that, certainly can include equity concerns. One of the things that the statute provides for is to establish a process through these rules and guidelines for at the regional level there to be a process to define public welfare. And so, as many of you know, that's one of the considerations that the state includes in evaluating like water rights transfers, for example. And it was inserted into the statute because the Office of the State Engineer thought that it would be valuable and interesting to provide a structure by which regions could themselves define public welfare. Now, the questions related to that component of the statute are not at the in-person open houses, they're online only because it's a little bit nuanced and difficult to think about. But certainly that is one of the places in which sort of equity concerns or thinking about local values can come into play and what's ahead.
Thank you so
appreciate,
much. Oh, sorry.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
Phil,
just want to say, I appreciate knowing that there's this difference in the input that can be done at the public in-person meetings or the in-person meetings, and also then online.
yeah, and everything that's in the in-person meetings is online, but there are a few additional components that are online only. And those were the things that were a little bit more sort of policy wonkish, that we weren't sure that just anyone walking off the street would quite understand or get. But we definitely want input on those components. So I encourage everyone to participate online, even if you've been to an open house, to look for that additional content. And I don't know if Phil had something you wanted to add to this question on equity.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Let's.
Well, Hannah, I think that's all been excellent and really, really good questions and responses. And we can move to the community conversation about the questions.
Okay, great. So I thought what I do now, let's see if I can, I don't know why I had trouble with this earlier, but there we go. Now I've got it. I think I'm screen sharing again, hopefully.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. All right, so the last part of the time that we had together is what I sort of referred to earlier as an experiment. And partially this is an experiment because we're considering currently having a little series of kind of community conversations that are online, that could be like co-hosted by other folks. And in a way, this event is co-hosted by the advocates, where we would present essentially the questions that are at the open house event, so also questions that are online, and just have a conversation around them. Now, I want to make it really clear that we're not capturing during this conversation like official input that will be in our report that informs our first draft. So if you want to provide input, please go to the website or the open houses. But I thought I'd go through the questions just really quickly, and then we could just open it up for further conversation. So at the open house events and online, there, as I mentioned earlier, a number of stations. They're grouped around sort of different topics or themes. There is a why station, so that's sort of background information and purpose, and it includes the questions that are on the slide here. So what is most important to you when you think about planning for New Mexico's water future? What is the biggest water challenge facing you and your neighbors? What are the biggest water opportunities? In the next 50 years, New Mexico is expected to have at least 25% less water in rivers and a similar reduction in groundwater recharge. As water becomes more scarce, what are you most concerned about? Then there's a where station, and this sort of gets to the delineation of the regions, as I mentioned earlier. What do you think is most important to achieve by revising the regional water planning process? What communities do you consider to be part of your region? Like how do you identify when you sort of think about your region? What do you think is most important in terms of how boundaries are delineated? And I spoke earlier to like the potential for various options to optimize different kinds of outcomes. Which are the example boundary concept maps resonate with you most? That shouldn't have been on this slide. I'm sorry. That's hard because you don't even know what that's about. But if you go online or if you go to the open houses, there's sort of some concepts about outlining, as I said earlier, different sort of things that might be optimized by different iterations. Are there any other considerations not highlighted that should be included in determining how we delineate future regional water planning boundaries? Then there's a who station. And so this is kind of about who participates and where. What are the qualities that you would like to have in a planning process? What characteristics should future planning entity members have? How should different groups be involved in regional water planning and in what role? Is the current requirement for a minimum, this is the current statute, a minimum of 2 general public meetings during each planning cycle sufficient? And in what other ways should New Mexican be engaged in the planning process? So that's sort of the who and at what level do people engage in this future planning process? And then there's a what station. What key questions should each regional plan answer? What types of implementation strategies should be included? in regional water plans to create a balanced water future. What key information would you like to know about, there's a typo in here too, sorry, water projects, programs, and policies happening in your region, about the water projects, programs, and policies. What information is most important to track in the regional water planning process? And so I'm going to stop screen sharing here, or if it's helpful to look back at these questions, I can do that too. But the idea for the remainder of our time together is, obviously you could probably continue to ask questions on the previous component, but we're curious if anyone has a strong reaction to any of those questions, and something in particular that you'd like to engage in a conversation with us, with Dr. King and myself, or anyone else. Like, let's have a conversation is the idea. So, and with that, I would go ahead and open it up and look to Brittany or Anne to call on folks who have their hands up if you have anything you want to share.
Yeah, so if you want to ask a question, have a conversation, please go ahead and raise your hand. That way we don't get a bunch of people talking all at once, and I will call on you, and then we can do some back and forth that way. And please keep, your comments semi-brief so that we can let lots of people be in on the conversation. So Eduardo, I believe you have your hand up. Would you please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question? I think you're still muted. You're still muted. I think if you hold down your space bar, that'll unmute you. There you go.
Can you hear me?
We can,
Yes.
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 Okay. So if you look at the chat, my comments, you'll see that I look at everything that you have been doing a little different. I look at it at our water problem as a piece of a series of issues that we need to deal, not to stop global warming, because we cannot do that, but to teach our children, in my case, because I am 80, and grandchildren, how to live with a warming planet. And maybe during that time, they can find ways to begin to minimize its effects. But I see water as part of building resilience for communities like mine, for everybody. And that includes also food and energy resilience and economic resilience. So when you expect that what is in 50 years, New Mexico will have 25% less water, I forgot that statement and that question. I think that global warming is going to destroy a lot of assumptions that many people have, including scientists. And there is one issue that nobody wants to look at, which is people are kind of invited to come and live, for example, here in Santa Fe. You build apartments, the people come, and the county, of course, wants that because it's money for the county, taxes, and people keep on coming to a place that in I don't know how many more years will begin to have dunes, sand. Not the grasses are already disappearing where I live in El Dorado, which is part of the Galisteo Basin. Trees keep on dying. And well, you know the rest. If you read about global warming, we know the science, but I read about what is possible, the what if, and what people are writing about how to live with it. So all these issues cannot be dealt as a single issue. You maybe should meet with people who are talking about food resilience, energy resilience, and have a group that looks at this, what is happening to our cultural system, social system, and our earth systems here in where we are.
Eduardo, I'm going to ask them to respond if you have a answer to his perspective, so that we can also take some of our other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. And I'd love to hear from Phil on this as well. I guess a couple of thoughts on your comments, Eduardo. First, this entire initiative is about resilience, right? And in a place like New Mexico, water is life, right? So everything we do is reliant on water. So this effort isn't intended in any way to address stopping climate change impacts, which is something that obviously we all need to be engaging on as well, but preparing for the need to be resilient in the face of those impacts. And, you know, Phil spoke to this earlier and how urgent this is. Something that Phil said during the work that we did together on the Climate Policy and Infrastructure Task Force really stuck with me. And it's at one point, Phil said, you know, where we are 50 years from now is going to depend on where we are, where we start. And so building into how we're confronting these things now, planning for that resilience is of critical need and urgency. So one, I would say that. And then two, you know, the governor, when she was elected, created the Climate Change Task Force. That's been a forum by which the various state agencies engaged in planning for climate change have been able to interface across all of those components that you mentioned, you know, energy, disaster, you know, Department of Emergency and Homeland Security, like how are we addressing the urgent crises that we're seeing, including like the fires, etc. And also the task force, the Water Policy Infrastructure Task Force, really enhance the coordination occurring across the state agencies, so that we're not just in our little, we're only thinking about water, but what's the impacts, you know, engaging on the 50-year water plan. We also worked with Department of Health a bunch. So to your point, I think that effort is underway under this current governor. Now, obviously, there's still a lot more to do related to that. And I don't know if, Phil, you wanted to comment in any way on this question or discussion item.
Sure. I agree very wholeheartedly that we do need to take a holistic view of the problems we face. We probably also need to have some realistic expectations. You know, we're not going to conserve and implement new infrastructure projects and things like that to maintain the status quo. It's just not happening.
How are you going to do that?
Well, we're not, is what I'm saying. Certainly water conservation and infrastructure, we need to do to make get the most out of what water supply we do have. It is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient to address a change in supply of this magnitude. In many parts of the world, you've got population growing rapidly, so it exceeds the carrying capacity of the resource base. Here we have, comparatively speaking, a fairly stable population with a declining resource base, but it's still the problem is still the imbalance between supply and demand. And you're exactly right. Energy is a main player in climate change and in agriculture, and it all goes round and round. It's a highly complex system that we're dealing with, and to expect that you can fine tune it with one knob that's just not realistic. So we do certainly need to look at it on a holistic basis.
Well, thank you for those thoughtful responses. Debbie's had her hand up for some time. Debbie, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions, and one, I'm really new to this, so if this is a very obvious question, then I'm sorry that I'm asking it. But it seems like one of the big problems we have is accurate measurement. And so I'm wondering, is there like a specific plan in place for step by step what needs to happen in New Mexico so that we can begin to get accurate measurement? That's my first question. And then my second one is, it seems to me like kind of the elephant sitting in the room is change, the concept of change. And that is so difficult for people because you have all the fear and everything that goes with that. So how do we, as you as a group and we as a community, start to deal with the idea that we have got to get people comfortable with the changes that are coming?
I love this whole conversation so far. I'm really enjoying. Thank you, Debbie, for those thoughts. And I guess first to the data points piece, I think you know, we talked earlier about the request from New Mexico Tech for funding for groundwater data collection. They have a very good plan, and I think that's where, in terms of groundwater, supporting them in a path forward there is going to be really important. When it comes to surface water, we actually just Interstate Stream Commission, just at our last commission meeting, approved an agreement with USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, for stream gauging. We contribute heavily to stream gauging. This year we added through that process an additional couple of stream gauges, but I think funding and supporting the effort to collect additional data related to stream flows is also going to be really important. And then to your last point about change, I think that is precisely why, as Dr. King said earlier, this process needs to be iterative and ongoing. I think uncertainty is unsettling. Uncertainty is bad for business. Uncertainty is hard for farmers who are looking to the year ahead and trying to think through what they're going to plant, right? But the reality is that we're facing a lot of uncertainty. And so I think to the extent we can work together on crafting plans around, you know, the various potential hydrologies that we're facing. And this is a big part of the conversation that's occurring currently in the Colorado River Basin, which some of you may be watching. How do we essentially build into our management water schemes almost like knobs, right? Like, so if there's more water, how do we harness that productively? If there's less, how do we ramp back what we're using in a way that responds real time to the hydrology? And how do we have at least certainty about what will happen given different hydrologies, so that have agreement and consensus on what that needs to look like? And that's challenging and unsettling, right? I think the last thing I'd say in all of this is thank you guys for spending time thinking about this. This is not an easy thing to think about. I think many of us would like to just not think about it at all. However, I'm an optimist in that I think people are incredibly creative and resourceful, and if all the smart people come together to think through how do we plan for, you know, what are the contingencies, that's where we'll have the best likelihood for success in terms of weathering the changes ahead. And I'm sure Phil has thoughts on this as well.
The question of measurement is absolutely central to, you know, every aspect of water management that I am familiar with. Not only water management, but water administration and water governance. You've got to know, you've got to have information on the environment you're operating in. There certainly is a lack of surface water flow data, but you can, you can get on, hit a few websites and you can get a pretty good feel for what's going on around the state reasonably quickly with the U.S. Geologic Survey. The Bureau of Reclamation's got several local entities like Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District or EBID have, flow measurement structures or flow measurement capability that you can access. But when you start looking for groundwater data, it's dark down there.
Very good. Jeannie, I believe you're the next person to unmute. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I've past life was an educator at the college level, and so I was super impressed with the very logical set of questions and how you organize those questions. Those were fantastic. But as I looked at them, even as a reasonably educated person, I thought I don't think I would know how to answer even, a quarter of them, even to speculate, because I don't know enough. And so to me, we have a huge gap between what all of you excellent experts have to communicate. And the past water advocates workshops have been just wonderful in helping us lay people understand just how complicated this set of problems, crises are. But how do we get engagement if people don't feel knowledgeable enough to even really understand the questions or even have a clue about the implications of different answers? So to me, we need a huge educational effort that is directed not just to policymakers, but to ordinary the general public, because it seems to me clearly, coming from a business school, prices are going to have to go up. The value of this scarcer commodity is going to be more and more precious. It's going to affect so many decisions about where we live, how many children we have, what kind of businesses we can engage in. It's going to affect so many things that people need to understand the implications before they can even imagine how we can become resilient. And so that's where I think we ought to put our focus. And it's not just in the print media or on television, but we've got to address in social media. If I were Empress of New Mexico, I would ask every high school and college to offer courses in this particular issue. How are we going to address increasing water scarcity? And have classes offered and encourage students to take these classes to even begin to, because they're the ones who are going to be most affected. The people who are under 30 years old, probably. We old folks, it's our grandchildren. But the people who are going to suffer are going to be those young people. And I believe it's true that at this moment, they are the least knowledgeable about all of the ideas that we've discussed tonight. They just don't have an opportunity to learn it. A lot of other issues, that sort of thing. So education to me is so critically important that if it's not a priority, then we'll just have to wait till the crises come and fight it out.
I love this question too. Thank you so much. And we may be following up with you to pick your brain on how to do exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
I think it's worth highlighting that, two things. One, through this process and all of the engagement that I outlined earlier, the intent is to engage a much broader audience than we ever have before, and all different age groups, right? And so maybe those open house questions, we tried to make them accessible. They probably could have been more accessible, or some people feel like they weren't in the weeds enough. So we tried to strike the right balance. But we're learning, right? So I welcome all the feedback here. And number two, the very first recommendation in the governor's 50-year water action plan is around water education. And it's my understanding that she wanted that up front because she wants us to do exactly what you just said. How are we helping New Mexicans of all ages, including developing curriculum? It's called a water education template. WET is what it's called in the 50-year water action plan. that really helps people have water front and center in our consciousness. So like every time we turn the faucet, like we're thinking about it. And that was something that was critical for the governor to include in that. And so we will be working with her office and our colleagues across state agencies to implement that part of the 50-year water action plan. And would love your all's thoughts on how to do exactly that, how to engage this much broader audience.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Hannah, that was fabulous.
Kurt, I think we can take one more question if you want to unmute.
Okay. You were warned. One thing is very clear, especially down here in the lower Rio Grande, is that we don't have enough water to meet our current needs or our current demands, and we're not going to have enough water to meet our current demands. The water ain't there. If the municipalities down here were to say recycle 100% of their water, 100%, and industry was to recycle 100%, it wouldn't cure the problem. As things stand now, agriculture, of course, is the biggest, almost 80% user. It's the dominant user of groundwater. It's the only user of surface water. And the surface water, as you note, is not there. It's fading. And that's the only source of recharge for our local aquifer. As things stand right now, I've said this before, our municipal wells down here are going to be sucking sand in a few decades. It's not something that's 100 years off or the turn of the century. It's now. We've got to get more water no matter what we do. And I think the only thing we can do as a municipality is to sink wells down to the brackish water and go big time into desalination. Big time. Enough to supply all the needs of the cities of Las Cruces. I don't think we can afford to do the same for agriculture. If I was in the pecan business, I would be thinking of switching to furniture manufacture. End.
Well,
So-
if I could field that
Please
one.
go.
How you doing, Kurt?
Hi there. Same old, same old.
Yeah, it sounds like. Well, the one thing I would say, I've been doing some desal work down there, and it gets back to this notion that certainly technological advances or, infrastructure, new infrastructure like brackish water is absolutely necessary. In looking at it, I think that it is, as I say, necessary but not sufficient, probably even for the municipal demand down there. The hydrogeology is complicated there. There's river connections and things like that get messy. But you're right that we're probably not going to have another period like the 80s and 90s in, I don't know, several decades. In any decade, it's less likely now to occur than it was in the last century. So you're right, you can't keep using if you were in hydrologic balance in a wetter cycle and the water supply dries down, you can't keep doing what you were doing. That's kind of our whole point here. There are infrastructure, there's little, a few thousand acre feet here and a few thousand acre feet there, but we're looking at a loss in the annual supply into Elephant Butte Reservoir that's hundreds of thousands of acre feet, not a few thousand or a few tens of thousands. It's an order of magnitude larger. And so we have to figure out how to deal with that. And there will certainly intersectoral transfers will be part of the solution. Taking water out of agricultural use and putting it to municipal and industrial use. At some point, you have to look at limiting use, and I know that's kind of sacrilege, but there I said it. Capping cumulative use. to stay within some sort of a reasonably functional hydrologic budget. And, you know, the math is not willing to negotiate, but hopefully the water users will be.
And if I could just add to that, you know, there's been some expression this evening about the urgency and the time that maybe the state is taking to develop these rules and guidelines. And as I've said before, we're wanting to take our time, not dragging it out, but to get it right, knowing that this is going to be in place for decades to come. Now, that doesn't mean that we are not in parallel working very actively with communities in urgent need. In fact, I was in Las Cruces in back-to-back meetings from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. today with various stakeholders in that part of the state, crafting the steps towards a plan to address exactly the challenges you're talking about, Kurt, that would include brackish water, but brackish water will be a part of the solution there. It's going to be a bunch of things that we're going to have to do. We know and we see that a lot of work is needed in the Middle Rio Grande. We're actively working and engaging around that as well. So those things, there are parallel paths here. We're working to implement this statute, but in parallel, we're really working actively with communities in need across the state as best we can, given our capacity at the state level.
Thank you so much. Kathleen, I think we could take your question. Just ask that you keep it brief because we have some closing slides and have the goal of wrapping up around 8. So you can go ahead and unmute. Kathleen, did we lose you?
I am not seeing her on the roster.
Here she
anymore.
is.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead. First,
Unmute.
She looks unmuted, but I still can't hear her.
yeah, Kathleen, we see you speaking, but we're not catching any audio. Can you try unmuting again? Try now. No, yeah.
Kathleen, if you would please post your question in the chat, maybe we can get to it that way, and I will start the closing slides, and then we will hopefully get you an answer if you can get that into the chat for us.
And Brittany, I was also going to say, I see a lot of, comments in the chat, some of which we didn't get to the extent it's helpful. If you want to send those to us, we could write some brief answers to them and get them back to you, and we'd be happy to do that. And really, again, we're so pleased that everyone was able to participate tonight, and looking forward to having all the perspectives at the table in terms of how to confront the challenges we're facing.
That's very generous. Thank you. We will definitely take you up on that offer. We will be posting this workshop, the chat, and those answers to our website. And so please check back on our website in a couple of days, and we'll get those posted up for you guys. So I have a challenge for all of you. We've talked a lot about the open houses. You got kind of a teaser taste tonight. What I would like you to do is to invite 2 or 3 of your non-water friends. Maybe it's your tennis partner, or you see this person at the dog park, or you go to church with them. Somebody who's not necessarily in your water world. Invite them to go to an open house in person. Maybe then go out to dinner, discuss what you learned at the open house, what you thought about, if you have any additional ideas, and then go to the online version and add those additional ideas that you came up with in your conversation with your friend after the open house online, so that we can give the ISC some really robust feedback going forward. So again, invite some friends, go to those open houses, go to the online open house, and give them as much information as we possibly can. We've got some fabulous presentations lined up for you. We've got all of our presentations lined up for the year. Our next presentation in July is going to be with Nat Chakras and Tanya Trujillo. Nat is the OSC General Counsel, and Tanya Trujillo is the Deputy State Engineer. They're going to be discussing the Rio Grande Compact and what needs to be done to ensure that we don't break that compact. So please come to that. I'm going to drop the registration link into the chat for you, if you give me 1 second to multitask. And then I am going to move on to the next slide, which are all of our other fabulous presentations that we have lined up for the rest of the year. So we don't do a workshop in December because everyone is just simply too busy in December, but we've got some really great workshops coming up. We've got part 2 from Bruce Thompson. If you didn't see part 1 was fabulous in May, and you can find that recording on our website. So Bruce is going to do a part 2. His first one was unconventional sources of water, and this one is what are our actual water resources? What water does New Mexico have? We're going to have a fabulous aridification panel in September. We're going to hear from Stacy Timmons. We talked about her funding request tonight about the Aquifer Research and Mapping program that they need money for, as well as the implementation of the Water Data Act. And then we're going to wrap up our workshops this year in November with Norm Gom and Donna Clayton presenting on what the priorities are for the 2025 legislature. We wanted to talk to you about that in November so that we can be ready to go lobby our legislators starting in January. So please come to our next workshops. I put the registration for July into the chats, and I wanted to thank all of our sponsors tonight. Amigos Bravos, the League of Women Voters of New Mexico, 350 New Mexico, Interfaith Power and Light, and New Mexico Wild. We couldn't do it without all of you, and thank you so much. And then thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your attendance. We know how busy your lives are, and the fact that you're putting water as a priority is just makes our hearts sing, and we're so grateful to each and every one of you who come to these workshops. If you enjoy these workshops and you want to continue working with us, we are looking for volunteers. We're currently looking for somebody to help edit our newsletter. So if that's something you're interested in doing, we'd love to have you on board. If you don't want to volunteer, but you want to donate, I'm putting the donation button in the chat. But we will be having a fundraiser coming up soon where we will have some matching money. So stay tuned to hear about those fundraising programs that we're going to be doing at the end of this summer. So again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Phil, for your wonderful presentations. Amazing to have you tonight. And thank you, everybody.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.